talking about what's going on in the latter part of the 19th century. Everything in the last half of the 19th century is really leading up to a major conflict. This is the conflict that we're going to call World War I, or at the time they referred to it as the Great War. Now, before we ever get to this particular chapter, we want to talk about what each country is doing uh, within its borders. But there are some common trends at the time, and we want to talk about economic trends first. And the first big economic trend at the time is something we refer to as industrialization. It's a big fancy word, but the reality is it simply means the process where machines start doing work that's traditionally done by hand. When you think of industrialization, you should think of factory work of some kind. So, like for instance, people used to sew clothes by hand, but we start developing sewing machines that allowed us to do that process by hand a little faster. And then we have machines now that put together clothing to the point where human beings are far less involved than they ever were. Right? There are advantages to industrialization, and we want to talk about those very briefly. Obviously, they can produce things at a more standardized rate. So if you have the same machine putting out the same t-shirt all the time, that t-shirt is going to be the same as the next one produced and the next one. And that wasn't always the case with human beings doing that. Now, industrialization not only gets a standardization of the product, but also it produces it more quickly. Machines are less apt to get tired, less apt to make mistakes, and so industrialization allows the production of materials, finished goods at a much quicker rate than what people can do it. Okay, and so that's going to change the way that we do business to an extent. Now, as businesses become more factory oriented, it also allows them to start gradually reducing the prices. They don't have to pay as much in labor for machines to do that particular work. You only have to pay for a machine and the maintenance or the upkeep for it, whereas workers require consistent pay over time. Industrialization is going to change the way that business is oriented and what the countries do with their resources that they have. Now, industrialization, as you're going to see, it's a good thing in a lot of ways, okay? But it's also a bad thing in some capacities. Obviously, one of the big things that comes with industrialization is a loss of jobs. People who did work by hand now have to find new work because machines have put them out of business. There's a great folk story that actually originates from West Virginia about John Henry, the steel-driving man who helped create tunnels. Human beings used to tunnel through mountains so that they could create a tunnel for trains to go through. Ultimately, John Henry was one of these people who was a tunneler, and there's a great story, a folk story about him battling a machine to see who could ultimately drill further faster. If you ever get a chance, check it out, The Ballad of John Henry. Now, industrialization not only takes jobs away, but you also lose some of the craftsmanship. In many instances, one-of-a-kind products now become standardized, and you don't get as many ornate features, as much care into that's put into making a particular product. And so industrialization is not always good. Right? You also see increases in pollution. When these factories are put up in the first place, these factories, they don't really consider the environment much about protecting the environment. And still that's true today. Factories don't always do that. And in many instances, these factories are dangerous places for people to work. In the late 19th and early 20th century, it was not uncommon for people to be injured or killed in factories, and there was little regard given to worker safety. Okay? You can see from this particular map right here that the Industrial Revolution, or industrialization as a whole, starts in Great Britain in the 1840s, and other countries are going to start to copy those patterns. They start to get ideas for machines of their own. They mimic the machines that the British make, and it spreads through continental Europe, mainly because they can't afford not to. Because industrialization allows you to make products at a faster pace, other countries have to copy this in order to keep up. And we'll talk about the British and the advantage that industrialization gives them, and ultimately why it starts there first. Okay? You'll also see too that industrialization changes the economic output. What you see here is a graph about GDP, gross domestic product. Okay? And gross domestic product is the value of all the goods and services that a country puts out on an annual basis. So if you took up if you registered or logged every single product that's sold in a given country in a year or any given service, then you add up all those figures, that tells you the GDP. And you can see right here in the mid to late 1800s, the GDP of other countries all over the world start taking off, especially in Western Europe and what you see labeled here as Western offshoots. Okay, industrialization also is going to create another big problem: wealth inequality. Right, what you see here, the percent of all income received by the top 1%. So take a look, for example, the very first country you see there is Russia in 1904. The top 1% of the people receive 13.5% of the nation's income, right? And Russia's not even the worst. You see England, Sweden, Finland, United States, Japan, China, Brazil, Peru, and South Africa here, and the numbers are staggering. What's happening is income inequality. Industrialization, the people who start the factories are the ones making all the money. But at the same time, they're not sharing that wealth with their workers, the people who ultimately are responsible for putting out those products, working in those factories. Right? And you can see that in England, in particular, England and Wales, which are both part of Great Britain, 28.6% of all income is ultimately taken in by the top 1% of people. And that's a problem, and it's going to create a big problem for many of these countries later on. So industrialization allows for a lot of interesting changes in society, but it creates problems as well. Okay? That's where we're stopping off with this video. We'll get into another segment of this particular chapter next. Industrialization, you can't forget this.